Which elements did the ancients know about? For this video, I'm using the modern. Let's start with copper. Learning about these ancient civilizations, it really is incredible to see just how advanced they were thousands of years ago. We humans have achieved so much since the dawn of civilization, it's kind of mind-blowing to think about. Imagine if civilization ended today and we needed a single encyclopedia.
It was a funeral fit for a king. That the deceased was technically a commoner didn't seem to matter. Lords, dukes, and earls were among the pallbearers. Even the famous French satirist Voltaire is rumored to have been in attendance. The deceased lay in state at Westminster Abbey as the crowd mourned the loss of one of the world's most important scientists, Sir Isaac Newton. He was entombed near a grand monument celebrating his many accomplishments. An inscription on the monument commemorated his work in mathematics, optics, and the movement of the heavens themselves. Newton had brought light to the world, and now that he was gone, darkness seemed to fall once again. But immediately after his death in 1727, something strange began to happen. A large body of his work was deemed unfit to print and was effectively hidden for more than 200 years. A biography published in 1752 grudgingly acknowledged Newton's relationship with this unsavory field of science, but assured its readers that it was in a cool, smart, Enlightenment way. An entire branch of Newton's work, spanning 30 years and roughly 1 million words, was being swept under the rug. The only clue that remained was on that monument, not in the epitaph, which has no mention of it, but instead in the relief on the side. Little cherubs play with scientific instruments related to Newton's work. A prism, a telescope, a balance, and a furnace. Which, wait, a furnace? What does a furnace have to do with optics, gravity, or math? Well, nothing, but it has a whole lot to do with alchemy. Yes, Sir Isaac Newton was an alchemist, one who sincerely believed that certain common metals could be turned into gold, and who sought the Philosopher's Stone, a legendary substance that would enable him to do so. This embarrassing superstition was politely ignored for centuries, until recent scholarship, which loudly proclaims it shouldn't have been, because it's not superstition and it's not embarrassing. Alchemists, who spent more than a millennium trying to turn cheap metals into gold, weren't just trying to get rich, they were trying to understand the world. When Newton described mystical-sounding substances like the scepter of Jove or the doves of Diana in his alchemy experiments, he was participating in a process that led straight to modern chemistry. This is the story of the man who has been called both the first scientist and the last magician, and how he hoped alchemy would unlock the secrets of the universe. History has preserved an extremely favorable portrait of Isaac Newton, and I'm not going to tell you it's not deserved, but we've left out some of the bits we find inconvenient. Just like every human being who has ever lived, Newton was a product of his time, and in his time, alchemy was accepted, if not quite mainstream, science. A little more secretive than most fields, granted. Newton never did publish very many of those million words on it, but his lab notebooks prove that he was actively carrying out experiments that he thought would lead to the Philosopher's Stone. To understand why, we first need to establish a few things about chemistry in the 17th century. Starting off with that name itself. There was actually no distinction between alchemy and chemistry at the time, so to represent this hybrid field, many scholars referred to chemistry with a Y.
I pronounce it with a southern accent as chemistry.
That's William Newman, a professor in the Department of History and Philosophy of Science and Medicine at Indiana University. He manages an online archive called The Chemistry of Isaac Newton, and he literally wrote the book on Newton and alchemy. Now, alchemists were interested in many things, like changing metals into gold, a process called transmutation. But they were also trying to make medicines, just like chemists today. Another big thing they were after was called the alkahest.
Famously, this is the universal solvent, which produced a logical problem. If it's a universal solvent, what do you store it in?
That's Justin Sledge, an academic who specializes in the history of Western esotericism. You can find him applying a scholarly lens to subjects like alchemy, magic, and Kabbalah on his YouTube channel, Esoterica. So how did Newton get lured in by the glittering promises of what many today consider mysticism? He was coming in at the end of a tradition that spanned centuries and cultures and goes all the way back to ancient Egypt.
So the going theory about where alchemy begins is in Egypt. And the idea that normally gets thrown about is that alchemy is a combination of two things. It's the combination of indigenous Egyptian metallurgical traditions, which were very advanced very early. I mean, all you have to do is look at something like the funerary mask of Tutankhamun. And then the combination of that with Greek theories of nature, which is to say primarily the Aristotelian theory of nature, of the four elements: earth, air, fire, and water. So in many ways, alchemy is born in Egypt, and it's born of the combination of Egyptian craft knowledge and Greek theoretical knowledge.
Things really seem to have gotten rolling in the city of Alexandria around the 3rd century CE. And a lot of what these early proto-alchemists were doing was strictly practical. It was kind of a blue-collar gig. They were doing things like producing fake gemstones or changing the color of metals to beautify temples. It was also a really egalitarian time, at least in the sense that we know of a lot of women who did alchemy in this period. If you've ever used a bain-marie in the kitchen, aka a double boiler, it bears the name of the alchemist who's said to have invented it way back in the 1st century, Maria Hebrea. And for me, hollandaise sauce is basically liquid gold, so having her name said by chefs thousands of years later is very well earned. Speaking of which, one of the techniques these alchemists had was changing the surface of silver to look like gold. All you needed was a little calcium oxide, sulfur, and, I quote, the urine of a youth. Heat it up and dunk the silver for just the right amount of time, and the surface turns a golden color. Modern chemists have reproduced this process, pee included, so it was definitely something they could do, and at some point, somebody had an aha moment. They asked themselves, why am I stopping at the surface? Why not go all the way and turn the whole thing gold? And thus, the dream of transmutation was born. This Roman-era melting pot of Greek, Egyptian, and Roman thought is also where we get the notion of Hermeticism.
So there was a sort of syncretistic religion that emerged sometime around the turn of the Common Era. No one knows exactly, where Hermes Trismegistus, Hermes the Thrice Great, is sort of a Greekified version of the Egyptian god Thoth, and 3 of the major so-called occult sciences become deeply associated with Hermes Trismegistus, those being Hermeticism as a philosophy, alchemy as a theory of nature, and astrology and magic being sort of the big 3 Hermetic sciences or occult sciences.
Yeah, those incomprehensible lines of text we've been showing throughout this video, they've been from the Emerald Tablet of Hermes Trismegistus, an incredibly important and incredibly confusing work of Hermetic literature. People, including Newton, have been trying to figure out what it means for centuries. It's probably about the Philosopher's Stone, though the whole thing is pretty cryptic, so if you know what it means, let us know. But it does bring us to an important point in our story, because we've reached the stage where the Philosopher's Stone is starting to pop up. Mentions of a stone that can transform things go back to around the 7th century. In the 8th century, Islamic scholars started to become super interested in alchemy. Modern scholars believe the Emerald Tablet was probably first written in Arabic. For the Islamic scholars, transmutation could be accomplished through different kinds of elixirs, a word whose Arabic origins become obvious when you swap the E for an A and pronounce it as al-iksir. That definite article, al, is also hanging out in alchemy, in case you hadn't noticed. But the most important development by the Islamic alchemists might be the sulfur-mercury theory of metals. The idea was that everything is made up of 2 things, sulfur and mercury. Sort of. Like so many good wrong ideas in the history of science, the reasoning traces its roots back to Aristotle, and the idea that sulfur and mercury were fundamental principles or exhalations that rise up from the earth.
We shouldn't think of them exclusively as modern elemental mercury and sulfur. Although they were that, we should also think of them as principles of fixedness, sulfur being a principle of fixedness, what holds a thing together, and mercury as a period of volatility, the process by which something can change.
The idea had real staying power all the way to the time of Newton, and the thing is, it's not as far-fetched as it sounds.
Part of the reason why the sulfur-mercury theory of the metals was so popular is that it is empirically verifiable in some sense. And what I mean by that is that if you take the natural occurring form of lead, galena, and you roast galena, what ends up happening is that as you roast it, the sulfur bound up with it, you can smell the sulfur come off of it. And that tells them, hold on, like there's sulfur in this. And then if you've ever seen molten lead, it looks a bit like mercury. And so the idea was, it seems like metals must be made of this sort of fundamental substrate of some combination of sulfur and mercury. And so the sulfur-mercury theory of the metals was successful because it matched what alchemists were noticing in their labs. And you can't blame them. It's a very good theory. It just happens to be an incorrect theory.
Basically, what people believed was that metals weren't fundamental elements as we know them today. They were more like compounds of sulfur and mercury, so it actually made complete sense that you could tweak the ratios and change one metal into another. And that's the first really important point I want to make here. When you hear the word alchemy, you might think of people putting a pinch of this and a little of that into a cauldron, hoping something good will happen, but having no real idea of what they're doing. Maybe wearing a cool hood to be extra mysterious. Or you might think of more recent pop culture iterations like The Witcher, or Full Metal Alchemist, or Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood if you want the more recent adaptation and to skip some of the smaller subplots. And also the movies are worth watching, so The Sacred Star of Milos is great. You can skip that if you want, but it takes place somewhere ambiguously during, I think, the second season if you want to be technical about when it happened. But real-life alchemists weren't fighting the forces of evil. They were conducting experiments, making observations, and drawing conclusions based on what they observed. They were building up a body of knowledge based on those conclusions and passing it along to others, which almost sounds like science, because it is. So Newton was working with a good but wrong theory. Fair enough, so are a lot of theories in the history of science. Still, how did alchemy get his attention in the first place?
Well, it appears to me that Newton got interested in alchemy at a pretty early age. I think it's actually an outgrowth of his adolescent interest in the field that in the 17th century was called natural magic, which is something that we know he had an interest in as a youth, because he took notes on 2 different books that fall into that general category.
His interest seemed to deepen when he goes off to college and starts reading the work of Robert Boyle. If you studied much chemistry, you might be going, wait, that Robert Boyle? The guy who came up with Boyle's Law from the textbooks? I thought that guy was a real chemist who didn't believe in superstitious junk like alchemy. Well, Boyle wasn't a chemist. He was a chemist, and chemistry included alchemy.
Yeah, this is a complicated matter, but it turns out that Boyle was far friendlier to alchemy than 20th century historians would have led us to believe. And that was, interestingly, something that was aided and abetted by the title of one of Boyle's most famous works, namely The Skeptical Chemist. If you don't read beyond the title, it sounds as though Boyle is skeptical about alchemy. The skepticism really had nothing to do with whether metals can be transmuted into one another or whether other things can be transmuted.
Boyle was actually taking issue with certain details of the sulfur-mercury theory. Transmutation, that he had no problem with. In fact, he claimed to have seen it performed with his own eyes, so it really was taken seriously by most chemists of the day. Boyle, an important figure in modern science and your chemistry homework, was a significant influence on Newton. But Newton also did a ton of reading beyond just Boyle. He studied the adepts, alchemists who claimed to have performed transmutation successfully, and naturally, he aspired to join their ranks. Newton had access to a basic chemical laboratory as early as 1669, when he was 26, but his notebooks don't record a ton of experimental work until a decade later. Why not?
I think because these texts were written in a kind of a riddling style. I mean, some of them are literally riddles. And Newton understood that in order to perform the practices recorded in the text, you had to decipher the text first. So throughout his alchemical career, he begins typically by synopsizing, that is, writing a kind of an abridgment of an alchemical text, and then he'll write commentaries on it in which he tries to decipher the riddles.
But Newman also says Newton could have been doing more experiments we just don't have notebooks for. It sounds simple, but the historical record often looks more like Swiss cheese than a craft single. Anyhow, one of these adepts wrote under the name of Irenaeus Philalethes. No one had ever met the guy, but his writing was circulated to a select few, and Newton, as a big alchemy fanboy, managed to get his paws on it. Newton devoted a lot of time to trying to understand Philalethes' procedures. He ran in circles trying to figure out the correct starting material to produce the Philosopher's Stone, and he deduced that the key was starting with lead. But it wasn't working out for him, and it was contradicting what other adepts were writing. He was also, probably wrong about Philalethes saying it was lead. This problem was driving him nuts. Philalethes was an adept. He had produced the stone already, so How could he possibly be wrong? One issue might have been that Philalethes' text was adapted from another alchemist called Sendivogius, so there might have been some telephone game going on. It was like reading a fan translation of Full Metal Alchemist. Although you do really have to hand it to the fanlations, especially when the series wasn't as popular overseas because they didn't have as many resources to work with and they were really doing it from the love of the Anyway, there was another bigger issue here, namely that, Philalethes never existed. He was the OC of one George Starkey, the so-called American philosopher. He was called this because it was pretty unusual for a philosopher to have come from America in the 1600s. In fact, he was one of the first few graduates of a new school that had opened up called Harvard.
I would argue he's really the unsung hero of early American science because this is a guy who was born in Bermuda, of all places, in 1628. Starkey claimed that this Irenaeus Philalethes was still living in New England, and Irenaeus Philalethes had given Starkey permission to circulate these manuscripts to a restricted circle of intelligent people. Starkey then was claiming that he was the middleman, and this put him in a very good position because as a middleman, he couldn't be held accountable for failed attempts at transmutation, which of course all such attempts would have been ultimately.
So Newton was working from a set of pretty flawed instructions. Eventually he course corrected and came up with a different plan, and around 1678, at the age of 35, it seems like he was ready to start trying to produce the Philosopher's Stone for real this time. That's nearly 10 years after he first gained access to a lab, and like I said, maybe he was doing some stuff before that we just don't know about, but it seems like it should be easier to start just following a recipe, right? Put some stuff in a flask, heat it up, and you're off. What was taking him so long? Well, the answer to that riddle is more riddles. But before I get to that, I have to pause for a quick ad about this cool shirt the SciShow team gave me.
It's me! I'm from the SciShow team! Alchemy was a weird time for science, thanks in part to all of the funky drawings and alchemical texts, which you have already seen sprinkled throughout this episode. We love these drawings so much, I mean, how could we not just look at them, that we put some of them on a shirt, which you can purchase at complexly.store/scishow. We've got the sun, the moon, some alchemical symbols, and of course a green lion devouring the sun. What do all of these mean? No spoilers. Tom will tell you in just a bit. Our graphic designer, Elliot Jung, did a great job of incorporating the other visual elements from this episode into the design, like the stairs, which are reminiscent of the stairs we made Tom sit on for an entire half day of recording. This shirt will only be available for 2 weeks, from today, October 17th, to October 31st. After that, it's gone forever. To get yours, again, go to complexly.store/scishow. And now, back to Tom for more about what all of these drawings mean.
Just because alchemy was science doesn't mean it wasn't weird in a beautiful, bewildering way. Remember how I said those texts were written as riddles? That wasn't an exaggeration. In fact, it might be more accurate to call them full-on escape rooms. A lot of alchemical information was in code. The names of various chemicals were usually replaced by metaphors called Decknamen, a German word that means cover names. One common example is that the sun and moon almost always referred to gold and silver, respectively, and other metals got the planets. In fact, one of these has even stuck with us to the present day. As cool as the name Quicksilver is, we still call that shiny, liquidy metal Mercury. Not that Decknamen were consistent, like how in modern chemistry Mercury is always Hg. Even the same author could switch between Decknamen if they felt like it. For example, in the book The 12 Keys of Basil Valentine, gold is the king in the first key, but in the second one it's Apollo. Why? Maybe the author wanted a new metaphor, maybe they just wanted to keep people on their toes. Strategically leaving out or moving around information was a trick alchemists often used to make their procedures just a little bit less accessible. A lot of manuscripts also used elaborate images to refer to procedures, ingredients, you name it. You get green lions eating the sun, and serpents biting their own tails, and sun-headed dudes climbing out of Mario pipes, and it's just great. Alchemists got to be scientists and artists. But it's also pretty tough to work out what you're looking for for under all this metaphor. Like, there's a wolf jumping over a fire, and you're supposed to just know that that means you need to purify gold with antimony ore. People joke that memes these days are cryptic, but alchemists were cooking back then too. And just like a cryptic meme, there were ways to decipher rhyme and reason in these messages, like the Green Lion one.
The green lion is aqua regia, because the only thing capable of attacking the sun, i.e. gold, is aqua regia, which is a combination of nitric acid and hydrochloric acid. And those two put together will dissolve gold. There's always a little bit of copper in there. Again, we're not dealing with modern labs where you have pure gold. You're dealing with alchemical labs where you have always some degree of contamination. And if you've ever done it right, you'll see that you're going to get some green.
In other words, as strange and mysterious as these images seem to us now, alchemists of the day would have been terminally online enough to infer what they meant. Also, there were usually corresponding instructions written down somewhere, even if they used a bunch of decknomen and stuff. But what was the point of these cryptic puzzles, besides being cool and fun?
There's multiple redundant reasons why the alchemists relied on these kinds of symbols. It's everything from just being a good shorthand, to hiding their trade secrets, to obliterating the fact that frankly, you just can't transmute lead into gold. It's just chemically not possible. So what better way of hiding that than dragons eating stuff?
And there were other reasons why alchemists operated in secrecy. They dealt with constant accusations of fraud and grift, not to mention greed. When in fact, many alchemists actually considered transmutation a solemn responsibility. It was known to many in the Middle Ages and the early modern period as a donum Dei, Latin for gift of God, one he'd bestow if you were worthy of it. Newton himself shared this view, and because it was so important, it needed to be kept between those who could handle it. He even called Boyle out once for discussing alchemy too publicly.
Newton, thought that alchemists had acquired tremendous power over nature and that they had both a moral obligation to keep it secret and also fear that they would be themselves attacked if their secrets were revealed.
And that's why we had to protect the identity of this very special interview we conducted with a real adept.
If you say you're working on transmutation, now all of a sudden every king and their cousin wants you to do it for them. They'll scoop you right off the street if you're not careful.
That's what happened to poor old Johann Böttger, who got himself arrested by the Elector of Saxony and spent a good chunk of his life in prison. He did figure out how to make porcelain though, so good for him.
Second, have you read an economics textbook? What do you think is going to happen when we can turn anything into gold? Pandemonium. You think Bitcoin is bad? No, this secret is staying safe with me.
And while some alchemists took these responsibilities and vows of secrecy very seriously, there were of course others who had, fewer moral qualms.
So you have to bear in mind, this was long before there were organizations like the National Science Foundation that supported basic chemistry, right? So in order to attract a patron, one had to typically present oneself as successful in that area. So basically you can see these alchemical demonstrations where people we nowadays would call charlatans traveling from city to city performing transmutations as grant proposals, early grant proposals. That's the way I look at it.
I think my favorite example of someone who was probably an alchemical grifter was Edward Kelly. Ultimately, and he was famous because his ears had been cut off for forgery. So he was a con man, de-eared on account of it. And at any rate, he made big claims that he could do transmutation, and Rudolf II invited him into his court. Rudolf II was probably the most welcoming of people interested in the occult sciences anywhere in the world. But this is always a problem. You make the big promise, and can you do it? And if you make the promise, you become very dangerous, because the more likely that you are able to produce silver and gold, the closer the local monarch needs to keep you. Because if you can do it, you can destabilize their economy. And if you can do it, they want you under their beck and call. It's Oppenheimer, right? You're the Oppenheimer. And so basically what ends up happening, what transforms from a invitation to be an alchemist, a court alchemist, becomes imprisoned. And of course, Edward Kelly is very famous because that is how he dies. He attempts to escape from basically an alchemical prison, and he falls and badly breaks both of his legs, and this leads to some kind of infection, and he ultimately dies a couple days later.
But in spite of all the zany stories, there were loads of people who took the whole gift from God thing completely seriously. People who were doing serious, rational experiments on transmutation. And the wild thing is that by sometime in the early modern period, around the 1500s, they had worked out what they thought was a canonical process to making the Philosopher's Stone. The thing in alchemy, the MacGuffin, the Holy Grail, the Philosopher's Stone, literally. Sure, they hadn't figured it out down to the microgram, but people at this time widely agreed that these were the steps to make it. It goes like this. First, you put a bunch of in an oval flask with a long neck. Then
What was that?
you know, some... It's not important, we'll get back to that. Then you seal the flask according to the principles of Hermetic wisdom. It's hermetically sealed. Yes, that's where that expression comes from. Next, you heat it up. Quick advice for any aspiring transmuters out there, don't heat up sealed flasks unless your goal is explosions, which it shouldn't be. After a month or so of heating, the substance inside will turn black. Then it will flash through a series of colors compared to a peacock's tail, until eventually it turns white. Now, if you're tired at this point, you can actually stop here and get a perfectly usable white version of the stone that can turn base metals into silver, which is, hey, not too shabby. But for the real adepts watching, you can crank up the temperature and keep heating. The substance inside will turn yellow, then red. Crack open the flask, carry out a few more steps, and bada bing, bada boom, you've got yourself a handy dandy Philosopher's Stone. A deep red substance that can penetrate metals and turn them to gold. Sounds pretty easy, but of course, if it was, somebody would have done it by now.
And my favorite thing to do in any alchemical experiment where they're attempting to do a transmutation of silver or gold is to very carefully follow, and at some point in every alchemical experiment, and then a miracle happens, the hand wave moment. And then you get gold and you can transmute it and project it and, all this sort of stuff. And it's always interesting following it up to that point, because there is chemistry, there is science, there is experimentalism until a miracle happens.
Everybody was really sure that this was totally going to work eventually. The problem was that mysterious something at the start of the recipe, the first material that you put in that flask, the seed of the Philosopher's Stone. Nobody knew what that something was, but everyone was trying to find it. Because if you could, well, you could change the world. Newton devoted decades to alchemical experimentation from his 30s to his 50s, until he moved to London to work for the Royal Mint in 1696. And he was always in pursuit of that something, that precursor ingredient to the Philosopher's Stone. It's too complicated to get into what exactly he thought that something was. There are flowcharts, I'm not kidding. In fact, it seemed like he thought he needed to produce quite a few somethings and put them through a bunch of complicated steps before anything ever went into that hermetically sealed flask. So what were those somethings that he made? Well, spoiler alerts, not the Philosopher's Stone, sorry. But he did produce quite a few interesting things. One of them was called liquor of antimony, based on work by Boyle, the skeptical chemist. Newton also produced something he called sophic sal ammoniac. Sal ammoniac normally referred to ammonium chloride, but Newton's version seemed to have involved antimony. He made a compound described by Starkey as Vulcan's net, an alloy of copper and antimony. And yes, in case you're sensing a pattern here, he really liked antimony. A number of alchemists did. While some thought mercury or salts were the right starting material for the Philosopher's Stone, antimony was also a popular choice due to what we'd now call its properties as a semi-metal or metalloid. It's brittle like glass, but shiny like metal. It clearly had in-between properties that made it seem like it could hold some kind of key to metalness. None of these somethings were themselves the Philosopher's Stone, but all were attempts to discover the perfect candidate for becoming the stone. And all this work culminates in Newton's unpublished work called Praxis. This text is so wildly imaginative that it has been interpreted as either a masterpiece or the result of a nervous breakdown. Newman argues it's the former, and it does seem to be a pretty systematic attempt to lay out exactly how to get to the Philosopher's Stone. In fact, for all practical purposes, what Newton is doing here is just chemistry. You can see him doing things like mass balance and qualitative analysis that are totally familiar to anyone who's seen the inside of a chemistry lab. He even had many of the same problems. In his own words, "Well, I was so close to producing the oak described by Philalethes, and then ye glass broke." Oh, buddy, we've all been there. Please don't send me to ye principal's office. 'Twas an accident. But joking aside, that does bring us to the really big question, one we've been circling around all this time. Why? Why is Newton, by all accounts a pretty smart guy, spending decades of his life using real chemistry procedures and methods for the Philosopher's Stone? Let's get the obvious out of the way. Yes, the goal of the Philosopher's Stone was to produce gold.
Yeah, you're trying to make gold, and that's not to say that you're not trying to make gold because you're not greedy. I'm sure every alchemist, if they could make gold, they would have been more than happy to have a little bit more gold in their pocket.
But there's so much more to it than that, more than the greedy or even the moral reasons. If the sulfur-mercury theory is the standard model of physics, then transmutation is the Higgs boson. Let me explain. The finer details of particle physics are too much to get into right now, but a few years back, researchers found a particle called the Higgs boson that demonstrated that our understanding of the universe is at least mostly on the right track. It was this big hole they needed to plug. It was a big thumbs up and sigh of relief that we don't need to throw out every physics textbook. In a similar way, the sulfur-mercury theory was also a kind of theory of everything for metals.
But they are, in some sense, trying to think about how to perfect nature. And in order to perfect nature, you need to be able to control how nature produces itself. And if nature can produce gold, you should be able to do it as well. And so, yeah, it's about bringing nature to its completion.
Folks up to and including Newton believed that metals were in some sense a living thing, that they were growing deep within the earth, being produced by these principles of mercury and sulfur. And again, this theory isn't as far-fetched as it sounds. If you look at the inside of a mine, or just open up Minecraft, you can see ores winding their way through the rock like tree roots. If the alchemists could recreate in the lab what nature was already doing on a grand scale, that would prove that they were right. It would show that their understanding of nature was correct, just like the Higgs boson. And so, re-enter Isaac Newton, the last of the magicians. He could also be called an occultist in the sense that occult means hidden. He sought to unveil the forces that he believed God had hidden in nature. After all, gravity is invisible, and the component colors of light were obscure until Newton revealed them. And in alchemy, he was trying to decipher the hidden processes occurring deep underground, the fundamental nature of the metals. Alchemy is, in many ways, right up his alley, just the next item on his checklist through nature.
Newton was like, I think God has hidden a lot of things from us. And it's the task to go find those hidden things. And so Newton, in that way, as an occultist, is much closer to a modern physicist for whom it's obvious that there are hidden forces in nature. And I think that rather than running away from Newton the occultist, scientists should be like, yeah, he was more right than you could have ever imagined.
So, let's flip the question on its head. You might be feeling pretty alchemy-pilled at this point in the video, but if alchemy was so important to Newton's understanding of the universe, why did he ever stop? Newton went off to London to work at the Royal Mint in 1696 at the age of 53, and we have very little evidence for him doing much alchemical stuff after that. This was the time of his life when much of his greatest scientific work was done, and he didn't pass away until 1727 at the age of 84. So, what changed? One possible reason he quit is simple.
I think that it is not a good look if the head of your mint is secretly trying to produce gold and silver, because what separates a successful alchemist from a counterfeiter? And again, it's dangerous. If you can actually produce gold and silver at will, what's the value of gold and silver?
And it wasn't just the mint. Newton's star was rising in a big way, from becoming president of the English Royal Society, joining the French version, to the whole knighthood thing. Lots of eyes were on him. Other theories have been proposed, up to and including a messy breakup. Newton was collaborating with a dashing young Swiss alchemist named Nicolas Fatio de Douillet in 1693, and the idea is that Fatio got alchemy in the divorce. But the historical evidence seems to contradict the idea that they broke things off abruptly. In fact, others think that Newton never quit alchemy at all. Newman has published evidence that Newton was still corresponding with colleagues about alchemy during his time at the Mint, just on the down low. Also, the dating of Newton's unpublished praxis isn't clear. The earliest possible year is 1693, since it mentions Fatio, but it actually could have been later. And even as an old man, Newton once observed to his nephew-in-law that he'd like to go back and have another touch at metals. Basically, there's no reason to think Newton gave up on alchemy entirely, but the same can't be said for Europe as a whole. The year for the death of transmutational alchemy is sometimes given as 1722, just 5 years before the death of Newton. That's when a talk was given at the French Academy of Sciences condemning fraudulent practices in transmutation. If you look closely,
Hi everybody, it's me Farmals here. How you doing? I asked and you answered. I put a poll on my Instagram story asking if you guys wanted to see an updated tutorial for my iron farm. And here we are. Today I'm going to show you how to build this iron farm. It works in Minecraft Java 1.19 and up. It's insanely simple to build and
The game doesn't check for collisions with adjacent blocks when spawning an iron golem, and the golems are so wide that their heads can spawn into a space where they suffocate. This is slower than using lava. It takes 50 seconds to suffocate a golem, versus it will still take another 5 minutes before despawning. And so, with the rate that the farm suffocates golems, it will take on average about 26 minutes before a group of ingots disappears. And as long as you stop by that farm more often than that, you won't lose anything. That said, a hopper only takes 5 ingots to make, so it's not hard to upgrade the farm to guarantee that there will be no losses. Okay, on to building this thing. Start by finding a village by some flat terrain. A relatively easy way to find a village is to go to the ocean and then ride a boat following the coast until you see one. Don't bother traveling down the rivers, just follow the ocean coast. Once you're in the village, take 6 beds from the houses. You'll need 3 of these beds for the farm itself, and 3 more to lure the villagers to the farm. To start your build, find a flat section of ground at least 8 blocks away from any lower ground, or caves, or ravines. You can listen for mob noises during the day to detect any hidden caves. In addition to the beds, you'll need 3 trapdoors, 2 slabs, a ladder, a boat, and at least 6 torches to prevent spawning on certain blocks. You'll also need a bucket of water so that drops are swept to a central place. If you don't have enough iron to make a bucket yet, don't worry, the first iron golem that is made in the farm will drop enough for you to craft one. Start by digging a trench 3 blocks long and 7 blocks deep. Expand the bottom of the trench into a 3x3x3 room. Add a trapdoor and 2 slabs to create a partition between the villagers and zombie, and add the bed so that the pillows are right up against the partition. Continue building a space for the boat and zombie. This space has a 2x3 footprint. It's 2 blocks tall on the sides along with the slabs, and 3 blocks tall in the middle. Go straight down in the middle of this 2x3 space, jump up, and leave a boat so that it is sideways. Next, build a set of steps leading back to the surface. It's important that the base of the stairs has at least 1 block that is even with the floor of the chamber. Spawn-proof the stairs with torches so that golems and mobs don't show up here. Replace the block for the last step of the stairs, and add trapdoors. Go back to the original trench that you... Go straight down in the middle of this 2x3 space, jump up, and leave a boat so that it is sideways. Digging a trench 3 blocks long and 7 blocks deep. 6 torches to prevent spawning on certain blocks. You also need a bucket of water so that drops are swept to a central place. If you don't have enough iron to make a bucket yet, don't worry, the first iron golem that is made in the farm will drop enough for you to craft one. Start by digging a trench 3 blocks long and 7 blocks deep. Expand the bottom of the trench into a 3x3x3 room. Add a trapdoor and 2 slabs to create a partition between the villagers and zombie, and add the bed so that the pillows are right up against the partition. Continue building a space for the boat and zombie. This space has a 2x3 footprint. It's 2 blocks tall on the sides along with the slabs, and 3 blocks tall in the middle. Go straight down in the middle of this 2x3 space, jump up, and leave a boat so that it is sideways. Next, build a set of steps leading back to the surface. It's important that the base of the stairs has at least 1 block that is even with the floor of the chamber. Spawn-proof the stairs with torches so that golems and mobs don't show up here. Replace the block for the last step of the stairs, and add trapdoors. Go back to the original trench that you made, and place 3 beds over the trench so that the pillows are over the empty spaces in the ground. Now, dig a 9x5 spawning platform that runs alongside the village and zombie chamber that you just made on the ground. Start by going around the perimeter, and then add 8 blocks on the island in the middle with a 1 block gap between each of them. Finish digging out the platform so that it's 2 blocks deep. Place a torch down to spawn-proof the collection spot for the drops, and a ladder in the corner to get out. And add the bed so that the pillows are right up against the partition. Continue building a space for the boat and zombie. This space has a 2x3 footprint. It's 2 blocks tall on the sides and 7 blocks deep. Expand the bottom of the... Now remove the suffocation blocks to finish this important upgrade. There's a good chance that iron golems may show up from the nearby village. These golems will interfere with your iron farm, so you need to keep them at least 16 blocks away from the villagers inside your farm. You can do this by using a lead on a golem or setting up a fence to surround your farm. If you add additional iron farms, keep them far enough away from each other so that the iron golems in one farm don't interfere with the spawning at another. At the start of this video, I mentioned that this iron farm can be up and running by the first Minecraft night, and that's not an exaggeration. I hope you enjoy this demonstration on a random seed that I've for the last step of the are right up against the partition, and 7 Start by digging a trench 3 blocks long and 7 blocks deep. Expand the bottom of the trench into a 3 by 3 by 3 room. Add a trapdoor. And 2 slabs of the trench into a 3 by 3 by 3 room. Add a trapdoor and 2 slabs bottom of the trench blocks long and 7 blocks deep. Expand the bottom of the trench into a 3 by 3 by 3 room. Add a trapdoor and 2 slabs to create a partition between the villagers and zombie, and add the beds so that the pillows are right up against the partition between the villagers and zombie, and add the beds so that the pillows are right up against the partition. Continue building a space for and add the beds, door, and 2 slabs to create a partition between the villagers. Three room. Add a trapdoor and 2 slabs to create a partition between the villagers and zombie, and add the beds so that the pillows are right up against the partition. Continue building a space for the boat and zombie. This space has a 2 by 3 footprint. It's 2 blocks tall on the sides, aligned with the slabs, and 3 blocks tall in the middle. Look straight down in the middle of this 2 by 3 space. Jump up and leave a boat so that it is sideways down in the middle of with the slabs, and 2 by 3 footprint. Continue building a space for the boat and zombie. This space has a 2 by 3 footprint. It's 2 blocks tall on the sides, aligned with the slabs, and 3 blocks tall in the middle. Look straight down in the middle of this 2 by 3 space, blocks tall in the middle. It's 2 blocks space for the boat and zombie. This space has a 2 by 3 footprint. Continue building a space for the boat and zombie. This space has a 2 by 3 footprint. Villagers and zombie. Add a trapdoor and 2 slabs to create a partition between the villagers and zombie, and add the beds so that the pillows are right up against the partition. Continue building a space for the boat and zombie. This space has a 2 by 3 footprint. It's 2 blocks tall on the sides, aligned with the slabs, and 3 blocks tall in the middle. Look straight down in the middle of this 2 by 3 space. Jump up and leave a boat so that it is sideways. Next, build a set of steps leading back to the surface. It's important that the base of the stairs has at least 1 block that is even with the floor of the chamber. Spawn-proof the stairs with torches so that golems and mobs don't show up here. Replace the block for the last step of the stairs and add trapdoors. Go back to the original trench that you made and place 3 beds over the trench so that the pillows are over the empty spaces in the ground. Now, dig a 9 by 5 spawning platform that runs alongside the village and zombie chamber that you just made underground. Start by going around the perimeter, and then add 8 blocks on the island in the middle with a 1-block gap between each of them. Finish digging out 8-block zombie chamber. Now, dig a trench so that the pillows are... Go back to the original trench that you made and place 3 beds over the trench so that the pillows are over the empty spaces in the ground. Now, dig a 9x5 spawning platform that runs alongside the village and zombie chamber that you just made underground. Start by going around the perimeter, and then add 8 blocks on the island that you just made. Dig a knot so that the pillows are over the empty spaces in the ground. Now, dig a 9x5 spawning platform that runs alongside the village and zombie chamber that you just made underground. Start by going around the perimeter, and then add 8 blocks on the island in the middle with a 1-block gap between each of them. Finish digging out the platform so that it it's 2 blocks deep. Place a torch down to spawn-proof the collection spot for the drops, and a ladder in the corner to get out. Use a hoe to turn the dirt along one side into farmland. Corner to get out. Place a torch down to spawn-proof the collection spot for the drops, and a ladder in the corner to get out. Use a hoe to turn the dirt along one side into farmland. This prevents the iron golem from spawning in these spaces, which would mess up the farm. Add water to the opposite corners of the platform, and be sure to double check later on that the farmland is hydrated. At dusk, villagers will start to sleep in the beds that you set at the surface. Knock the beds out from under them so that they fall into the farm. Cover up the hole when you're done to prevent anything else from going in. At night, lure a zombie to the trapdoors. When he falls in, close the trapdoor that is on the top of the steps first, then he'll go down into the steps and into the boat automatically. If everything is done right, your farm should start in a moment. Now that you've completed the basic starter farm, let's talk about upgrading it. Pretty quickly, you should have enough iron to set up a hopper and a chest. And when you build a set of steps down to access the chest, place down a torch next to it so that you can spawn-proof that spot from the golems. Later in the game, when you find lava, you can use a gate and 3 signs to suspend the lava over the hopper. Open the gate so that the golem can pass through it, and now place down a 4th sign. This one goes on top of the gate. This sign fireproofs the gate so that it doesn't burn from the lava. Now remove the suffocation blocks to finish this important upgrade. There is a good chance that iron golems may show up from the nearby village. These golems will interfere with your iron farm, so you need to keep them at least 16 blocks away from the villagers inside your farm. You can do this by using a lead on a golem, or setting up a fence to surround your farm. If you add additional iron farms, keep them far enough away from each other so that the iron golems in one farm Don't interfere with the spawning at another. At the start of this video, I mentioned that this iron farm can be up and running by the first Minecraft night, and that's not an exaggeration. I hope you enjoy this demonstration on a random seed that I've never played before. Thanks for watching. Beds out from under them so that they fall. At night, lure a zombie to the trapdoors. When he falls in, close the trapdoor that is on the top of the steps first, then he'll go down into the steps and into the boat automatically. If everything is done right, your farm should start in a moment. Now that you've completed the basic starter farm, let's talk about upgrading it. Pretty quickly, if everything is done right, your farm should start in a moment. Now that you've completed the basic starter farm, let's talk about upgrading it. Pretty quickly, you should have enough iron to set up a hopper and a chest. And when you build a set of steps down to access the chest, place down a torch next to it so that you can spawn-proof that spot from the golems. Later in the game, when you find lava, you can use a gate and 3 signs to suspend the lava over the hopper. Open the gate and the golem's chest. Place down a torch and a chest. And when you build a set of steps down to access the chest, place down a torch next to it.
So Minecraft, believe it or not, has over 1,000 collectible blocks in the latest version of the game that you can obtain in survival saplings to be able to get more blocks from. So a little platform on top of this farm, and you need to put water on top of every single one of those blocks, and then you need to break it for the guardians to spawn. Okay, this is on what we're gonna do next. I farmed a bunch of stone. And then with those emeralds, if you're lucky, you can actually get some wool trades on the second level of the shepherds. And we're looking to so stinking long. I feel like I'm in a Narfi video. This is this is so freaking chaotic. Oh my gosh, they just keep coming. Dude, how the heck? Okay, I need to get out of here. I need to run away and just let these guys despawn. This is like my only option here. This is ridiculous, guys. I can't believe this actually happened. Oh, they're all gone. Every single one of my villagers is gone, dude. Whatever. I have an idea. I'm gonna take this lava bucket. I'm gonna pillar up on top of this mob grinder, and I'm just gonna rain lava on top of these guys. Oh my gosh, guys, I'm an idiot. I totally forgot that you could make shields, dude. I'm gonna do that right now. Guys. Oh my gosh, guys, I'm an idiot. I totally forgot that you could make shields, dude. I'm gonna do that right now. Guess what? I got a shield now. You stupid. Get out of the area and slap some beds, give him some bread, and we got ourselves a villager breeder. All right, here we go. Our villager breeder is completed. Now we just gotta wait for these guys to breed and we can get ourselves some villagers. So we have a decent amount of bald people laying around. I think I'm gonna kidnap some of these guys and just make myself an iron farm. So to start it off, we're gonna lay down a bunch of slabs. This is gonna stop the iron golems from spawning where we don't want them to. Oh, yo, we got another watering trader. Ooh. Oh my gosh, I like what I see. We got 2 saplings. And luckily, I was prepared. Look at this. I have, where are they? Emeralds for days to trade with this guy. Shout out to the villagers. You guys are awesome. Now we just got to go on a shopping spree and just buy pretty much everything that we can get from this guy. Watering trader number 2. I don't think we need this guy anymore, but we are going to keep him just in case we do need him. Trader's away. Like, technically, we can get that. Now back to what we were doing. We were trying to build ourselves an iron farm, and this is honestly pretty easy one to build. It's based off of Ian X04's design, just not built inside of the ground. Now we just need to get a zombie inside of it, and the easiest way to do that
And he'll go down into the steps.
is just to get not built inside of the ground. Now we just need to get a, it's based off of Ian X04's design, just not built inside of the ground. Now we just need to get a zombie inside of it, and the oh my god, this is not a, oh, that's a whole this no, yo, this is I need ridiculous. Every idea I'm on top of these right now. Guess what? I got a shield now, guys. That, oh my gosh, and they just need to start repopulating. So while these guys did their thing, I went ahead and built another iron farm. This way I can double my production of iron. And as it turns out, if you just use a little tiny bit of brain power, you can actually move zombies pretty easily. Then the last thing you got to do is just relocate some villagers to a more permanent location. And just like that, we have 3 working iron farms, all of them producing a decent amount of iron. And using some of that iron, I was able to craft an
closely, the author technically doesn't ever dismiss the idea of real transmutation, and there's evidence people were still practicing it on the sly at the Academy up until the 1760s. Still, even if this time period wasn't when people stopped doing transmutation, it's when they stopped doing it out loud.
If you mean by alchemy transmutational alchemy, it comes into disrepute beginning really widely in the first quarter of the 18th century. But their basis for doing this was purely empirical. It wasn't theoretical. There was no theoretical reason why 18th century chemists should have rejected transmutation. It simply had to do with the fact that they couldn't make it work and they didn't know anybody who could. So 18th century chemistry is still doing alchemy, but without the open attempt to transmute base metals into gold.
It's kind of simple, really. People were finally starting to catch on to the idea that transmutation just wasn't getting anywhere, and science marched on as science does. The scholar Lawrence Principe at Johns Hopkins has made the argument that alchemy had to go to clear the way for chemistry as a respectable profession. Alchemy was greedy, fraudulent, and above all, dirty. But chemistry, that was where the good stuff was, from medicines to gunpowder. And so, this smear campaign resulted in the split we have now. No longer chemistry, now there was fake, superstitious alchemy and proper scientific chemistry. Alchemy was the scapegoat left holding all the mistakes that are a natural part of real science. From the 18th to the 20th centuries, that unfair reputation remained stubbornly intact. But now, scholars, including Newman and Principe, are fighting to give alchemy its rightful place in the history of science. And the way they're doing it is by, of all things, actually recreating experiments done by the adepts. See, one way to study the history of alchemy is to sit down at a lab bench and do it. Alchemists weren't just making stuff up and writing it down, at least not entirely. We've shown that in trying to produce the Philosopher's Stone, they were doing real experiments. But the best way to prove that is to actually follow their instructions.
Well, I think the short answer to the question of why we try to replicate alchemical experiments is that there's just no other way to understand the text unless you try to see what people were actually doing. So anybody who studied chemistry today can tell you that reading a chemistry book is a very different thing from doing a chemical laboratory course. But, even somebody who hasn't taken chemistry courses, someone who has tried using a cookbook can tell you this. I mean, what does it mean when they talk about folding the egg whites into a mixture? This is not obvious. You may think you know what it means, but when you actually try it out, you'll find that you may have trouble breaking the very eggs and separating the whites and the yolks before you can even whip the whites separate from the yolks to make that.
Consider the time Principe tried to recreate a medicine from an early 17th century work by someone writing under the name of Basil Valentine, whose book 12 Keys we've already mentioned. This work follows an idea that you can purify the poison out of a material in order to turn it into a medicine. In this case, the recipe once again calls for every alchemist's favorite, say it with me, antimony, and says a red solution will be the end result. If you were just to read this, you might think it was bogus. Antimony is A, always poisonous, and B, never red in solution, so this recipe can't possibly have worked. And it didn't work, not when Principe tried it with modern pure lab reagents and tools. But then he realized the author of the text didn't have those things, so he tried again with intentionally contaminated reagents and iron tools. And it worked like a charm. The final product didn't actually contain antimony, it was iron acetate, which isn't terribly medicinal, but is a step up in the poison department, so in a way, the recipe worked. It demonstrated what its author meant to, which was removing the poisonous properties from the starting material. An even more shocking development comes from Newton's own notebooks.
Newton was doing chemistry, I think, in the strictest sense of the term, and in some respects, he was even doing new chemistry. Because his processes are things that chemists don't typically do today. For example, I recently wrote an article with two X-ray diffraction crystallographers, David Bish and Marin Pink, at Indiana University, where I recreated one of Newton's compounds and they analyzed it. And it turns out that the product was something that no one had made before, at least since Newton.
This paper is still making its way through the publication process at the time we're filming, but Newman kindly provided us an advance copy, and it is a page-turner. They followed a procedure from one of Newton's letters to Fatio and obtained a greenish mix of solids. One of these was the new compound, which seems to be a complex mix of ammonium, copper, and chlorine, and it doesn't even seem to be the only novel compound obtained from recreating Newton's experiments. The authors say we should be taking notes. Newton's old alchemical methods could give us hints towards new ways of synthesizing chemicals today. Alchemy was science. It always has been. Maybe not in the sense we know it now. That wasn't a thing until Newton's time, and you can't expect people to follow rules that haven't been invented yet. But it was founded in observation and experimentation, in failing and trying again, in drawing conclusions and sharing them with others. And it was born of a sincere desire to understand the way the world worked. The alchemists were wrong about a lot of stuff, but being wrong sets you up to be right later. They were secretive, but it was because they believed in the solemn responsibility bestowed on them by God. And if they were mysterious and mystical at times, well, that just adds to the fun.
We should be much more open to the fact that the history of science is a messy history, and that just because the alchemists had a fundamentally flawed theory of nature, which we probably also still have a flawed theory of nature, we have no combined theory for quantum mechanics and gravity. We know our theory is wrong. The alchemists, I think many of them must have also known something was wrong too, because everyone claims to be able to do this and no one could. And so I think that the way we should approach alchemy is with a great deal of intellectual humility, is that even if they were laboring under a fundamentally false theory of nature, they were still careful experimentalists. They were still attempting to try to reproduce what they observed in nature in a lab and record those results and try to get them reproduced, and even publishing them so that other people could reproduce them. So to draw a line that says before this was superstition and after this was science, I think is a misunderstanding of what science is, how knowledge production happens, what empiricism looks like in practice.
And that brings us back to Newton, the first scientist and the last magician, the occultist who revealed what was hidden, who brought light even to light itself, the man whose pursuit of the great work of transmutation was the capstone of 1,500 years of rational experimentation. He never did turn lead into gold, but he did help transform the obscured elements of nature into something that could be seen and studied. Alchemy led to chemistry, which led to medicine and agricultural advances and a million other things. Which, if you ask me, it's not too bad for a magic trick.
If I asked you what you thought most people associate with ancient Greece, you would probably mention something about philosophy and rationalism. The great thinkers of the ancient world, such as Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and the Stoics, are of course household names that have come to represent the ancient Greek legacy. But this picture is usually incomplete. Ancient Greece and these thinkers, to many, represent some kind of pure rationalistic or scientific endeavor, a precursor to our own enlightened age before it was interrupted by the entrance of religion and superstition, which dominated human thinking until the Renaissance or even the Enlightenment. This image of history is of course criminally incorrect and oversimplified, and for various different reasons. Not least because the ancient Greeks aren't really what many people assume. At least not if we base our understanding on the above narrative that I mentioned. In fact, while figures like Plato indeed put an emphasis on reason and argument to come to many of their philosophical conclusions, this is not the whole picture. Many of these same philosophers were also deeply involved in things that we would call religious practice or even mysticism, and even saw that as a superior way to reach truth than through limited reason and human intellect. In fact, ancient Greece was filled with different kinds of what we could call mystical practices and mystical experiences, which have been largely ignored, at least earlier in history, have been largely ignored by many historians working on this topic. It doesn't really fit into our narrative of the ancient Greeks as our sort of rational, intellectual ancestors. And the way that we portray this topic really says more about ourselves and the way that we see ourselves than it does about the actual people we're trying to portray. So in this episode, we're going to once again look at this more forgotten aspect of ancient Greek culture as we explore very broadly what we could call mysticism or mystical experiences in the ancient Hellenic world. Where does one begin to cover such a broad topic? We will of course have to limit ourselves to certain expressions of what we call quote-unquote mysticism here. What even is mysticism? Returning viewers will know that it is a contested term and concept, and it's of course even more so when we use it outside of a Christian or at least Abrahamic framework. In this case, we have a bit more luck in the sense that the term mysticism, or at least mystic and mystical, actually are Greek words originally, coming from the term mys, meaning conceal, or mystikos, meaning initiate. With that said, the word doesn't really get the meaning that we associate with it today until the writings of the Christian theologian Pseudo-Dionysius, and even more so really during the 16th and 17th centuries when the term mysticism became a thing. But keeping in mind what we have said in earlier episodes about it, we can here also use a kind of working definition of mysticism, or mystical, as that which concerns experiences of, practices related to, and explanations of direct encounters with the divine, usually also accompanied by altered states of consciousness. With this definition, we can find it all over ancient Greece. While the incorrect picture of ancient Greece that I mentioned above is still very prevalent, even among academics and historians, many have begun to question it and present an alternative history of this culture. Among them is of course the scholar E.R. Dodds, who, especially with his foundational work, The Greeks and the Irrational, show that we need to take these other, what he calls irrational, aspects of ancient Greece into serious consideration. And this of course includes famous aspects like the prophetic role of the oracles, such as the most famous one at Delphi, who received messages from the gods through ecstatic altered states of consciousness. We also have the influence of the muses on poets and artists, what Plato refers to as poetic mania. A poet can never create by his own imagination something as great and beautiful as a work influenced by the divine madness imparted by the muses. But we should perhaps begin this discussion by exploring one of the most fascinating aspects of ancient Hellenic culture, religion, and quote-unquote mysticism, the mystery cults. This is a category that denotes several different movements that were initiatory in different ways, and which promised to their initiates some kind of secret knowledge or wisdom. Some of the more prominent of these are the Eleusinian mysteries, the Bacchic cult of Dionysus, and the so-called Orphics. Many would even argue that early Pythagoreanism was also a kind of mystery cult. Now, the Eleusinian Mysteries was the largest and most popular or famous of these mystery cults. Indeed, in ancient times, it is thought that the majority of Athenians, so citizens of the city of Athens, were initiated into the Eleusinian Mysteries. This was an annual initiatory event that took place in the town of Eleusis, close to Athens. On the days of the ritual, hundreds or maybe even thousands of people would walk from Athens to Eleusis, swinging branches and singing songs. Once on location, they would also fast and then drink a beverage called the kykion, before entering a building called the telesterion, where the core of the secret ritual took place. We actually don't know a lot of details about what went on in the telesterion. This was a secret ritual and people weren't really supposed to talk about what went on at this ritual, and most people seem to have kept their mouths shut. What we do know is that the ritual revolved around certain mythical stories, particularly around two goddesses, Demeter and Persephone, also known as Kori, and particularly the story when Persephone is abducted by Hades to the underworld. And then Demeter, her mother, is sort of distraught, trying to find her. She seeks the help of the gods, who help her eventually, spoiler alert, retrieve Persephone back from the underworld. And so this is a sort of, it's imagery that talks about the changing of the seasons and stuff like this. But so this is the mythical account that is at the center of the Eleusinian Mysteries. And this descent into the underworld of Persephone is a very key theme, a very key feature of this myth that is sort of symbolically played out in certain ways during this ritual. It seems that the initiates were taken through an intense experience involving altered states of consciousness, where they would somehow simulate Persephone's descent into the underworld, dying to then be reborn once again at the end of the ritual. This stuff seems to have been very intense, and the initiates are said to have been completely transformed by the experience, many even claiming to lose their fear of death entirely after going through this initiation.